So my mission here at WFIU is to cover arts and culture in southern Indiana. The thing is, when you've spent the past couple months worrying about the health of your democracy, local arts coverage starts to feel like too little too late. Though I will say I believe you can't have a healthy democracy without lively and thoughtful arts and culture. But still, sometimes you want to face things a little more head-on. So I decided to invite my friend Faye Gleisser for an interview. She's a professor in the art history department here at Indiana University. And I get it. Art history professor does not leap out and say actively involved in our political situation. I don't know about you, but when I think art history, I picture students listening to a lecture about the slant of light and paintings of religious epiphanies. Cool stuff, but different from protesting injustice in the streets. Faye Gleisser is not that kind of art historian. She actually feels complicated about calling herself an art historian at all. Her book is called Risk Work. It came out in 2023, and it's about how in the 1960s, artists started using new tactics in response to changes in, wait for it, policing. It's about policing in art. And so, in this conversation, we talk about the relationship between those two things and about an article she wrote about artists at risk in Indiana. Full disclosure, I read a draft of that article and offered some thoughts on it. And don't worry, I do ask her how art can resist fascism. The answer was not what I expected. This is, by the way, Interstates. I'm Alex Chambers. That conversation is coming up soon. So soon. Don't touch that jump ahead button, unless it's a really short jump. Support for Interstates comes from Columbus Area Visitor Center, celebrating everywhere art and unexpected architecture in Columbus, Indiana. Tickets for guided architecture tours and more at columbus.in.us. Could you start by introducing yourself?
Of course. So my name's Faye Gleisser, and I'm Associate Professor of Contemporary Art and Critical Theory here in the Art History Department, and also a curator, an independent curator.
Do you consider yourself an art historian?
What a loaded question.
I didn't think that would be loaded, but I was thinking of you as an art historian because you're in the art history department.
Yes, technically I am an art historian. My doctorate is in art history from Northwestern. But I do feel a tension with that that kind of role, but I like that kind of tension because I like to teach classes. I like to do art historical research that I hope pushes at what has already been considered to be the bounds or the shape of what art history is or what an art historian does. And so I think one of my greatest compliments I can get from a student, and it happens every once in a while, is when they're like, this really isn't what I thought an art history class would be, or this is not like my other art history classes, or, I didn't know that we would be considering policing and sociological analysis in an art history class. So I do take pride in being, in this kind of antagonistic relationship with art history. So thank you for asking. That's more of a therapy session, I think.
Well, this is Interstate, so it's somewhere between therapy and, something else. So let's just get right into it then. You worked in museums before you did your PhD, and then you ended up writing this book that maybe I should just describe briefly. So it's called Risk Work, and it's about how artists in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s started taking some new approaches to art. Instead of doing paintings or sculptures that would sort of sit in museums, they were doing performances that would show up in public space. Some just quick examples would be the group ASCO, which staged photos of gang war victims that were fictional, or Pope L, who's been crawling through urban streets for decades now. And what you're talking about in the book is how these artists show us how policing and surveillance were getting more intense in that same period. So how did you end up writing about so much about like policing and surveillance when you're coming from this art background?
I think it does make a lot of sense to start by talking about the museum context for the book project, because, and it's something I could only really realize when I was finishing the book in 2021, 2022, looking back on having worked on it for about 10 years, really, because it was based on my dissertation, then substantial revisions happened after. But I would say that it kind of started for me when I was in my first job after undergrad. I was an art history major at WashU in St. Louis, and I moved to Washington, D.C. for an internship at the Hirshhorn, and that was unpaid, and I needed to make money to support myself. So
for those of us who aren't in the art world, the Hirshhorn is a contemporary
art museum.
Okay.
Yeah. So the Hirshhorn's a really wonderful contemporary art museum, and I was working on an exhibition there, and it was a great experience. But a lot of museum internships at that time, and there's been a real reckoning with this in the art world, were and continue to be unpaid. So it creates these kind of inequities, class inequities, gendered, racialized inequities, because of the unpaidness of it. But so to support myself, I had 4 part-time jobs, actually, and one of them was being a paralegal, and I'll come back to that because I think that's related too, for a medical malpractice lawyer. And my other paid job was to be a security guard at the Phillips Collection. And the Phillips Collection is located in DuPont Circle. The museum is known for being one of the largest collections outside of Paris of holding Impressionism and post-Impressionistic works. Like, they have Renoir's Boating Party there, a very famous painting. So my job was to stand in the galleries and be a security guard, and then I got promoted, so to speak, where I then ran the surveillance cameras. I got promoted. The promotion was that I no longer stood in the galleries but went underground and sat in front of like 200 live feed CCTV cameras.
It's wild.
Yeah, and at that time I was doing a master's in art history, and I ended up writing a lot of my research papers in front of these cameras because my shift was Sundays from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. So I would be there from 3 to 6 p.m. Then the museum shut down. I was part of shutting the museum down. And then, from like 6 to 11 p.m., I was surveilling dark, empty galleries and had to point the cameras on the street. And in doing this job, this was when I started asking these questions of what is the relationship between art viewing experiences, art museums, and securitization.
Can I just ask, like, a side question? Did you just see, like, weird stuff happening?
Yes. Yeah, no, it was this job was so important. It really changed my whole understanding of what museums are, what art in museums does, who it's for, because this was in Washington, D.C., and I was working after hours. After the museum closed, there was a lot of private events that were held by diplomats, and I would work with Secret Service, security guards, private security guards, caterers, like all the people coming in and out of the building had to go through me because I was controlling the doors and the cameras. And so that was I did that for about 2 years while I was doing my master's. And yeah, I saw weird things. I mean, I saw, I would say I saw cute things too. I saw a lot of people on dates, and we had a Mark Rothko room at the Phillips that was kind of dark because that was a stipulation for the paintings. And so people go in there, make out, and I would see it on the cameras. People think they're not being watched in a museum, but you're being seen from every angle because the museum is holding very expensive assets. And so this is when I started thinking about property management, risk management, policing, and also was reflecting on why am I the one sitting here in this space? How did I get here? What kind of training do I have to be protecting the art? Or, it was just, that was a really important job to have. And it wasn't until I went to grad school many years later that I then started thinking about these relationships in a research context. And that's, what led to a lot of the questions that shape risk work.
Right.
And I could say what some of those questions are.
That would actually be great. I think we should get into risk work a little bit. So tell me about those questions. Risk work, Making Art and Guerrilla Tactics in Punitive America, 1967 to 1987 is the full title.
Yes. So it does focus on the U.S., on U.S.-based artists from the 60s through the 80s in urban context. So the book looks at artists who are turning to performance and conceptual practice and what is often called guerrilla art, meaning art that is perceived to be spontaneous, happening out on the street, not in art-sanctioned spaces, or if it's happening in a museum, it's kind of in this hijacking of semi-private public space unexpectedly. So yeah, like a really important group that formed in the late 60s called Guerrilla Art Action Group. They formed in New York, and they were doing a lot of anti-war in the context of the American-Vietnam War activism and drawing these connections between the philanthropy, the money of the art world and connecting it to the war machine because, you know, they in one of their very early pieces, they pointed out the fact that the Rockefellers, which were on the board of trustees for MoMA, for the Museum of Modern Art in New York, were also investing a lot in the manufacture of arms. Mm-hmm. And so they're tracking, and this is, you know, a story that's very salient now in terms of kind of the activism that's happening right now around the relationship between the art world and Palestine and Israel and arms manufacturing and oil money. And so
I'd like to probably get into some examples of that too.
Yeah. So artists have, like Guerrilla Art Action Group, which was founded by Jean Tosh and John Hendricks in 1969. So they're doing these kind of hijacking, sabotaging of space in the museum, and then other artists, like you mentioned, Popel, crawling through Times Square in the 70s. So I was looking at this constellation of artists who were turning to guerrilla tactics in this particular moment, and the project first started with the question of why are artists using guerrilla tactics as art? Instead of, you know, there were militant groups, there were militant reformists. So I was asking, why are artists turning to guerrilla tactics as an aesthetic practice and maybe not explicitly as activism, even though their practice was activist?
Right. Right. Why aren't they just getting involved in like some protest or demonstration group?
Right. And a lot of them were, but so they're doing this at the same time.
Okay.
And then the questions kind of evolved into, that was my dissertation, was looking at artists and asking that question. Why are they using guerrilla tactics? What does that mean? What is the biography of guerrilla as a concept, aesthetically and materially? And then in the book, I actually asked this different set of questions, which is, okay, if artists are turning to guerrilla tactics in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when that also is this moment of the expansion of policing and carcerality and prison construction and management, what can we then learn from artists' aesthetic practice and the ways that they're anticipating policing and arrest in their work? So I actually then go back to their artwork as kind of an archive of the history of policing in the U.S. Because I look at artists as theorists of everyday life, and I see these artists as being very attuned to laws and policies that were governing public space. And so their work during this period really documents these changes because they're anticipating where police will be, where they won't be, so they can stage a work, where there will be security cameras, where there won't be security cameras. So often in art history, these stories about guerrilla art are kind of written off as pranks or unserious practice. And I was really interested in going back and saying, actually, if we think of artists as theorists, then let's see what they're theorizing. Let's see what questions they're asking.
Can you just say what you mean by artists as theorists?
Sure. One kind of theory that I'm thinking about is spatial theory. So artists who occupy space for their aesthetic practice are theorizing what it means to be in those places, and their work raises questions such as who gets to control space, who's governing space, who belongs in space, who gets to decide who's actions are legitimate within space. And those are theoretical and philosophical questions.
Right. Basically, they're trying to use their art to ask questions about who has power in spaces and how space works.
Yeah.
Like, I think a more sort of well-known example would be Duchamp's Urinal, which is asking, like, what counts as art? And so that's also theorizing. But what you're saying is that these artists are thinking about public space, or not necessarily just public space, but like space outside of the museum and trying to figure out how that space works.
Yeah. And
who
I think,
controls it, as you said.
right. And thank you for bringing in power. That's such an important word. And also, these artists they're asking questions that are also revealing how asymmetrical these power dynamics are. So, to go back to the example of Guerrilla Art Action Group founded by Jean Toche and John Hendricks, these are two white men who are doing really important anti-war activism. They are also, at that time, organizing in relationship to, they were inspired by the Black Panther Party, by the Young Lords, and they were thinking about the blatant racism, the anti-blackness of the art world, and they are also aware of their own kind of privilege as white men and their ability to enter these museum spaces. And so they go in anticipating possibly being arrested when they, for example, take a painting off the wall and hold it hostage so that their demands for free admission into MoMA are heard. But they also are doing this based on the expectation that even if they're arrested, they will survive that encounter. They are not going into that thinking that they may die while in custody. And that is part of what I was trying to talk about in the book, which is this idea of punitive literacy, becoming literate or being literate in punitive relations based on the body and space one inhabits and the range of different relationships to state-sanctioned violence that exist within that body.
Right. So like how, say, a middle-class white artist doesn't necessarily need to think about certain kinds of risk or police involvement in the same way that someone who is, not middle class or is Black or Latino.
Well, and can I add to that?
Please.
Because I think that is a really important point. And in the book, what I want to do is also kind of push on that too, because another key artist in the book is Chris Burden. He's a white male artist who has been called the danger artist, quote unquote. And he passed away, I think, almost 10 years ago. But he was really known for these really spectacularly risky, quote unquote, performances. Like, he became very well known for a piece called Shoot, where he had a friend shoot him in a gallery space in the arm in the early 1970s, and he became very famous for these kinds of actions. And another one he became very famous for because he got arrested was posing as a faux automobile accident victim. He put himself under a tarp, wedged himself under tires of a car in the gallery district of Los Angeles in 1972. This piece he called Dead Man, and he had meant for this to be what he called a social sculpture, where he was going to set up this scene of, aftermath of a fake accident. And his idea was that he would light these flares, people would gather around on the street, and then eventually the flares would go out and he would stand up and he'd be like, this was the piece, this was Dead Man. But what happened is a passerby called the police thinking he had been harmed or there was a dead person under the tarp. So the police come and they lift it up, and it's Chris Burden and he's fine. And so they arrest him for causing a false emergency to be reported. And there's a 3-day trial. He's acquitted. And that gets written up in the New York Times. So this ability to play with public space in a way that he survives police encounter is what launches his career in many ways. But to your, how you were really helpfully saying that this is the part of this history of risk-taking guerrilla practice is that maybe artists like Chris Burden, white male artists, white women of a certain class are not anticipating arrest. Like, they don't have to worry about risk-taking the same way. What I wanted to also say in the book is it's not just that they're not worrying about it, it's that they have been conditioned to expect they will be okay. So it's not so much that he wasn't worried, it's that he expected to be okay, and he was also pissed that the police came because he said they ruined his peace. So it was this idea that he's like, why are they even here? Like, I shouldn't be stopped. Like, I have access to public space. Like, I should be able to do this. And so to me, that's also his punitive literacy. That's not him being
it's not like
ignorant.
He's naive.
No, he is basing this off of his conditioning, which is accurate.
Right.
And that to me is a little different than him not thinking about it. I think he did think about it, but wasn't concerned.
Right.
And that might sound like the same thing, but...
No, I think I see how it's not, because like he actually did know what to expect, like you said.
Yeah, he did. And Guerrilla Art Action Group did too. And that's why these artists become very famous, because they get arrested or they encounter police and they get written up in this way. Whereas artists like Adrian Piper, who is a light-skinned Black woman who in 2013, 2014 said she actually was retiring from being a Black woman artist. But her work had this kind of much more belated or less spectacular, I guess, recognition tied to it. She was doing much more subtle, quiet, street-based conceptual photography, because she also had a different relationship to state-sanctioned violence and anti-Blackness. And so she was not looking to be arrested, or also not going into a urban space just expecting to be fine.
Right.
So, and those literacies and punitiveness then shape the history of art, because then they shape who becomes, whose art gets into the news, whose doesn't.
Right, the way Chris Burden gets written up in the New York Times.
Yes.
And then becomes famous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And other people who can't take those same kinds of risks with the same kinds of expectation of safety don't necessarily get the same kind of attention either as a result.
Right. And what I'm arguing is perhaps it's even more important to pay attention to the knowledge that's embedded within those tactics of surviving a carceral structure, or to even understand them, again, as theories of surviving or navigating or negotiating these different conditions of policing.
Which, I mean, one of the things that I found most interesting in the book was certainly that argument, but also just kind of experiencing how the different artists were navigating these various different new developments in policing and surveillance.
Yeah.
And that their artistic practices, I think, really showed us sort of the contours of what was happening with the policing.
Yeah.
In ways that I had not thought about, and clearly a lot of other people hadn't either.
Well, and I think this was kind of a revelation to me, and to go back to what you asked in the very beginning of, am I an art historian? I think art historians are expected to do research in art archives or art museums and artist studios. And what I found in this project was that I was doing research in police archives and medical archives. And what I found was a police archive is an art historical archive when the police are observing artists and surveilling them and taking notes on them. And also, on the flip side of that, art historical archives are also police archives, because they're also documenting this history of policing. So again, that to me is why I like remaining in the discipline of art history, but mostly in order to just push on what we think we know about it, or what it could be, or what kinds of questions belong as art historical questions. Yeah.
I think that point that police archives are also art historical archives, when they're sort of interacting on some level with something that's being conceived of as art, also maps onto your experience in the museum, working on the surveillance side of the museum. It sort of feels like a useful analogy also for helping us understand that, how those... Because we can't, on some level, we can't really have a museum, or it's, if you don't have to think too hard, I think, to realize that a big part of a museum is its security.
Yes. And because it's protecting property,
right,
not people.
Right.
It's protecting property, which is the history of policing. Policing did not emerge to protect people, it emerged to protect property.
Mm-hmm.
And so the history of art is always already entangled in the history of policing. One does not exist without the other in many ways because, the very long history of insurance is tied to asset and property protection. And art is one of the most powerful forms of property that goes back ages, centuries and centuries, right. Wars fought over and through the procurement and protection of objects. And that's a very fraught story that we're probably not going to get into right now.
We don't quite have the number of hours it's going to take to get into all that. No.
No, but it is really kind of mind-blowing once you tap into that.
Yeah.
Because there is a big, one of the, I think, largest misconceptions for people who are maybe not studying art history or who are just getting introduced to these kinds of historical relationships, I would say a really large misconception is that art happens over here and politics happens over there. Mm-hmm. And that there's this divide. And that comes up a lot. But if you step into really any art history classroom, that's going to be demystified and, complicated. But they're really, and you see tropes of that come up in, in the 60s and 70s, before this kind of huge reform. That's what a lot of the artists were pushing against because museums said they were apolitical. They said they were neutral. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what Guerrilla Art Action Group is trying to show, is that, no, you have a board of trustees who are really wealthy people invested in oil and arms manufacturing. So, no, it's deeply political, actually.
Right. In your conclusion, you have a somewhat more recent example of the guy who put the paintings or photographs. I think it was more recent, right?
Yeah. Raphael Shimuna.
Yeah, remind me that one.
Yeah. So the epilogue to the book jumps to the present to try to think about the afterlives of the 60s through the 80s. And how, these earlier generations of artists and their archives of punitive literacy are shaping contemporary art practice now, because so many of these arts have become so canonical. So contemporary artists now know them, know their stories, are learning from how they navigated policing structures and things like that. And Raphael, he's based in New York. He's an activist organizer and artist. And I think it was I can't remember exactly the year of the Whitney Biennial that we're talking about. I think it was 2018.
Yeah, 2018.
Yeah, so that biennial ended up being called the Tear Gas Biennial colloquially because there was a lot of activism and dissent that happened within the context of that biennial. And this is at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. They hold this very famous biennial, which is this major showing of contemporary art every other year. And so it's a really big deal if you're an artist that's in this. It can change your whole career. Mm-hmm. And what came forward in this particular moment of 2018 was the staff of the museum and a number of artist activist group like Decolonize the Space organized together to call out the fact that Warren B. Kanders, who was then the chairman of the board of trustees, was also CEO of Safariland, which is one of the largest arms manufacturer, tear gas manufacturers in the world, and that this tear gas was being used on protesters in Ferguson, protesters at Standing Rock, protesters and people seeking asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border, and also was this chairman of the board of the Whitney that was holding a biennial that had artwork in it critiquing these structures of power, and yet all of the money and the markets and the arms manufacturing were tied up in the sustenance of the museum, the, infrastructure of it. And so these artists and activists, including Raphael, came together and called for Kanders to resign. And he eventually did, which is really important because that often does not happen.
Right.
But he did eventually, after months of protesting and open letter writing from the staff and artists, he did eventually step down. But in this moment, when the show was up in 2018, Raphael snuck in these two paintings, which were actually reproductions of photojournalists taking pictures of a mother and her two daughters trying to cross the U.S.-Mexico border and being tear gassed. And so he enlarged them, put them in frames, and installed them in this guerrilla action in the Whitney.
Wall.
Yeah, with wall text he had made up. And he did this with collaborators. He wasn't doing this on his own. He did as part of a collective that formed called Art v. War. But he did this anticipating the policing, carceral, or kind of surveillance structure of the museum. He knew he could bring objects into the museum that were a certain size. Those could go through security. And he also knew that the floor on which he installed the work had less video surveillance there. So he was using his literacy and punitiveness to make this guerrilla action possible as an art installation. And it lasted for about 30 minutes before guards came and took it down. But by then it had already gone up and kind of gone viral on Twitter and social media. So, and this does tie into this larger moment of critiquing arms manufacturing and calling for institutions to divest from these industries. And Raphael Shamunov is also a large part of the Jewish Voice for Peace activism in New York City. He's an organizer, and that group also uses a lot of aesthetic interventions and sit-ins and occupation of public space to draw attention to their cause, which is, calling for institutions to divest from arms manufacturing, of U.S.-backed bombing, of, Israel bombing Palestine. So,
right.
And, in another connection, Raphael, maybe I'll just stop there, actually, because I could keep going. But, this is all, there's this, knot of relations that is very historical, but also very contemporary in the way it continues to reproduce itself.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about how being at risk has a lot to do with policing, what it means to say artists are especially at risk in Indiana, and that big question of the relationship between art and fascism. Stick around. Support for Interstates comes from Mallard Grodner Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Mallard Grodner Attorneys, understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. On the web at lawmg.com. So this feels like also a good time to move and talk about some other contemporary situations that you've also written about, because you were asked, I think you were invited, right, to write about at-risk artists. So maybe you can describe the series first.
Yeah. So there is the art history journal called October, which is an important publication in the discipline of art history. And they, in 2021, started running this, what they called an occasional series of communities of artists at risk globally. So they started asking people in different tense contexts to write about artists and curators and art museum directors and how they were navigating authoritarianism and fascism and repressive kind of policies. And so the series up until this point has included places like Beirut in Lebanon, and I think there's sites in Cuba that were included, and China and Poland. There was a really important piece on Ukraine and, in the context of Ukraine and Russia conflict. And there hadn't yet been a piece on the U.S. context within this at-risk series for thinking about artists at risk.
And it seems like those places that you're mentioning are often places that we, maybe from the U.S. context, would see as particularly risky places to be. Dangerous, like disaster-prone, all kinds of things.
Yes. And this is something that Hannah Feldman, who's an art historian who was invited to write about the Lebanon context, a lot of her research is in Beirut, and so she interviewed a group of curators and artists based there. And in their conversation that I think was published in 2023 in the summer, pretty recent, they were having this conversation about what it means to be contemporary artists working in Beirut. And it came up that they were saying that Beirut had basically been pitched, quote unquote, to the art world as a site of disaster art. And that if you weren't making art that was disaster art, that was legible to, a very heavily New York, LA oriented contemporary art world, even globally, if the disaster art you were making wasn't legible in that way, or if you were making art that wasn't about disaster and crisis, that you weren't going to be seen as relevant.
Right.
And so
you might not get shows,
yes.
you might not get money, your career might not progress if you're doing, like, say, abstract paintings.
Yes. So that was part of what I was paying attention to when I got asked to contribute an installment to the series on artists at risk in Indiana. And I was invited because I had just written this book, Risk Work. So I was thinking about, the history of risk management and how I also learned how risk management, alongside the expansion of policing in the 70s, is also becoming industrialized in the U.S. and globally. Ulrich Beck, who's I believe, German sociologist, coined the term risk society in 1986. So post-1986, we apparently live in a risk society, which means risk is the main axis of relation globally. Instead of collaborating or working in solidarity, it was risk management, risk liability, anticipating risk became this huge global organizing force.
Which I think, just as a slight side note, maybe not, the opposite of risk, in my mind at least, is security.
Right.
And so there's this sense that you can achieve security if you're putting a lot of effort into risk management.
Yes. Well,
but that just gets into my dissertation, and we don't need to talk
I would
about
love
that.
to talk about your dissertation. I mean, and this is this is where the sociology is so important. And I have no training in sociology. I just read it as much as possible. Actually, I mean, I went to undergrad wanting to major in sociology. I got to WashU, and they're like, we don't have a sociology major.
Oh, no.
So they do now, but at the time they didn't. So, but I've tried to still, do that in art history. So it worked out.
Seems like,
But there are, sociologists of crisis and risk management, and they talk about the fact that risk is this idea that you can predict and control to a certain degree, that you can calculate your relationship to danger and control it. So danger is the thing you can't control. Risk, in relationship to danger, risk is the thing you can calculate your risks and make decisions, and that's what risk management is. And so it's based on this idea of control and prediction. And because we live in a risk society, if you can control your risk, if you can manage and anticipate your risk, that is a whole status. That's a currency. That's why we covet investment bankers who speculate. They are the ones who are calculating risk. And it's very classist, it's very racialized, it's very gendered. And so a really useful book on this, I think, is Randy Martin's Empire of Difference, where he gets into a theory of financialization. But what he says about risk that I found really, really helpful is, especially when we're thinking about at risk, and this is what I write about in this piece for October, thinking about artists in Indiana specifically, but also this idea of Indiana as a place that's quote unquote at risk and why that's problematic. But this idea of at risk suggests that there's the people who are at risk and there are the people who are safe, like you're saying. There's the risk and then there's the security. Right. But that's not at all what's happening. So Randy Martin talks about the reality, which is if we live in a risk society where the ability to manage your risk is really powerful and useful, then to the opposite of at risk isn't those who are beyond risk. It's those who are risk capable. So it's people who are very savvy in managing their risk. And so if you are at risk, what that actually translates to is you cannot manage your risks. So
Can you give an example?
Yeah, so that's part of the problem I find with the way we lean very often in advocacy work on wanting to name certain communities as at risk, because it's not a problem to give aid to communities that are vulnerable to crisis. But what that's doing, if you're just talking about at risk, is that you're not looking at the sources of vulnerability, the relations of power that are manufacturing that vulnerability and sustaining it. So I think, an example of being at risk in the sense that Martin is talking about, of not being able to manage, you're not being risk capable, I guess, it would be like most in a common usage of at risk, I would say, or I'll ask you, where does your mind go when you think of at risk? Like, what does that conjure for you culturally?
Yeah, I guess when I think of people who are at risk, I think of low-income people, poor people, more often people of color. People who don't have access to housing, or maybe people who do have plenty of access to housing but are more likely to be profiled by the police or interacted with by the police or whatever.
Right.
That would be one set of examples.
No, that is how it's used.
Right.
And so historically, at risk as a term is part of a policing apparatus that really emerges and then is fortified in the 70s and 80s in the U.S. context, at least, with this idea that, yes, certain low-income, often racialized, non-white communities are deemed at risk. And what that language is actually doing is saying that more police should be brought to those areas. And maybe some financial aid, but definitely more police. There should be more surveillance. And so... and
right, because the logic there is that not that they're at risk of having trouble surviving, but they're at risk of committing crimes.
Yeah, right? Yes. So this at risk is really language that is meant to justify and normalize the increased exposure to policing in certain areas and communities. And by calling it, at-risk advocacy, it's normalizing and concealing the fact that it's just bringing greater exposure to policing and not challenging, those power dynamics at all, actually just increasing them and reinforcing them. And so, at risk is this really tricky concept, I think. And it's also tricky because it can bring necessary humanitarian aid, but it's tied up in these very complicated power dynamics that aren't changing in that aid giving, in this kind of martyr, victim relationship. Instead of, if we were to push back on an at-risk framing of the crisis or vulnerabilities that are shaping lived realities in lower income areas, we would have a different kind of question of, and this is a question I turn to often from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a political geographer, and her question is, what is it that makes people vulnerable? So instead of saying who's at risk, which just reinforces this top-down kind of relationship, to ask this question of what is it that makes people vulnerable, then puts pressure back on who is benefiting from the at-riskness existing.
Yes.
And that's why I think at-risk can be useful if you spin it, if you break it apart from these rosy ideas of just, aid and help and support for people in need versus, and the philanthropy itself is a very fraught history of sustaining power relations.
Because one of the things about Ruth Wilson Gilmore's point about what makes people vulnerable is it switches us from thinking that the people who are at risk are just at risk because they're just naturally going to be at risk.
Right. Or they're not capable of managing the risk.
Right.
There is a moralizing aspect to it. They are not good at managing things, when actually people who have survived within a positionality of at-riskness are probably the most, savvy negotiators of, using resources in a very tactical,
in
strategic
thinking, for
way.
example, about the way ASCO, this art collective, was able to do these really quick, they wanted to create these art pieces that were photographs of gang experience, violence. I can't remember exactly the terminology, but the point is they knew how to approach the risk. They were able to stage this thing on the street, get in there, take the photographs that they wanted to take, and get out in a very effective way without actually bringing police presence in. So they were able to manage the risk.
Right. And part of why they're doing that is because, and this is a group that formed in East LA, which is the, predominantly Mexican-American area of Los Angeles. They formed in the early 1970s as a group of artists who identify as Chicano artist activists. And so they are thinking about that kind of positionality of Chicano embodiment in relationship to the heavily policed, heavily surveilled area of East LA where they live, and navigating that. And they use humor, they use performance, they use theater, because it also, dissipates some of that, like, possibility of being seen as threats.
Yeah.
So they're very savvy in using aesthetic practice to survive these situations.
So can we talk about Indiana?
Yeah.
So you got asked to write about Indiana as an at-risk place, or a place where artists are at risk.
Yes. And so I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I'm not native to Indiana, but I have been here this is my 9th year here teaching in the art history department. And I believe I was asked because of a number of events that have been percolating in the last couple of years, making big news headlines, like the Indiana state legislator defunding the Kinsey recently, like Kelly Morgan, who was associate curator of American art at Newfields in Indianapolis, resigning in 2020 and very openly critiquing the anti-Black and white supremacist kind of toxicity of the museum culture in Indianapolis. And then also Samia Halaby's show, Palestinian-American artist who is an alumni of Indiana University, was slated to have her first U.S. museum retrospective open.
Here at the Eskenazi Museum.
Yes, here at the Eskenazi Museum my dates are all off, but was it January 2024? I think.
It was going to open in February.
It was going to open February
2024,
right, but it was canceled in December 2023. And this, again, in the context of the genocide and destruction happening in Palestine.
Right, because the cancellation was about 2 months after October 7th, 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel, and then Israel's ongoing devastation of Gaza.
Right. So, and Halaby's a long-standing activist for Palestinian liberation and rights, and her work, which it's such a loss that we did not have that show open here. But the majority, if not all of the works that were planned to be on display at the Eskenazi were huge, colorful abstract paintings, and they were effectively censored by IU's administration, which canceled the show with no explanation other than basically like a 1 or 2 sentence comment made by a administrator saying, we're canceling the show because we cannot ensure the integrity of the works for the duration of the show, I think was something of the language they used.
They were canceling it due to concerns about guaranteeing the integrity of the exhibit for its duration. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So all of this had happened. Also, Indiana being, a state that's called a quote unquote red state with conservative politics and policies, made, I think, the editors of October, the journal, say, okay, Indiana's probably a place where artists are at risk because of all of these things and other things we haven't considered. So do you want to write about artists at risk in Indiana? And this was a really hard and also generative prompt, I think, because my instinct and my reaction was, I don't want to write about artists at risk, quote unquote, in Indiana, because it feels like this kind of crisis porn of the art world only wanting to pay attention to these really incredible, very savvy, innovative artists in Indiana only in relationship to crisis. And, you know, to that point that Hannah Feldman made about Beirut of, you know, Beirut being pitched as the disaster art kind of capital of the art world. And it felt like that. And that, you know,
as opposed to, like, say, the larger art world or this journal being actually interested in saying Samia Halabi has a retrospective, her first career retrospective,
right,
at the Eskenazi Museum on the Indiana University campus.
Right. And
it was only interesting once it was canceled.
Yes, right. Like, there would not have been a story about it otherwise. And, you know, to be very clear, this is not, I'm not blaming the editors of October. This is a much larger issue, which is how we fetishize violence and risk and crisis. That's not the editors doing that. They're just part of our larger ecosystem in which risk taking and risk management is a kind of currency because of being risk capable versus at risk is this whole very long fraught relationship that is tied up in power and celebrity and, you know, headlines that sell media and papers. So do not blame them for asking or for running the series, which is also has a lot of really important strategic, tactical information in the series. But I did want to be critical of the ask. And so the piece itself the essay tries to look at different artists and curators, including Kelly Morgan, who resigned from Newfields, including Samia Halabi, and also Javier Cordona Otero, who is a recent doctoral graduate of the education program here at IU, and also a performance artist who does pedagogical activist aesthetic practice. And so I looked at, and I included Rebecca Fassman, who's the curator of the Kinsey, and spoke to a number of artists and activists throughout the state. Also, Lauren Pacheco, who's based in Gary, Indiana, runs Destination Gary. So I wanted to look at artists and curators, you know, the art community in different parts of the state, but also really get a sense from the people I was talking to about the knowledge, this punitive literacy that's very useful to people outside of Indiana in a way so that we could kind of challenge this fetishizing of Indiana as a place where artists are at risk. Because what I learned and what the piece is about, ultimately the essay, is that when we ask artists the question, not who is at risk and what are they doing with that, but what is it that makes them vulnerable, to use Ruth Wilson Gilmore's question, that they are going to tell a story that actually is about the production of vulnerability through risk management that is happening everywhere. Like, this is not an Indiana thing. And yes, there are heightened risks in Indiana because of this, you know, the conservative policies and things like that. But also, you know, we're talking, Alex, today in this moment of, you know, kind of being glued to the news because of the fires that are decimating Los Angeles, which, you know, is a quote unquote blue state and has a Democratic mayor who apparently cut a lot of funding from the fire department and put it into the police department. And we're seeing like a real lack of resources for firefighting. And so this idea of at risk, it's not, I wouldn't say, you know, I mean, we could say artists are at risk right now in LA because of the fires, and that would be true. And at the same time, we could also say that the production of vulnerability in Los Angeles for artists and for everyone who's living there is tied up in overfunding policing. And that's not a California or an Indiana thing. That's part of risk management and the reconfiguration and consolidation of power structures and surveillance structures. So I wanted to write a kind of love letter to Indiana curators and artists by asking them these questions about, you know, the sources of vulnerability for them in Indiana, but also in a way that would let their stories speak to the much larger structures of violence, which in the essay, I talk about Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence, of administrative violence, which I'm also taking from Dean Spade and Shandan Reddy's work. So when we get so focused on crisis headlines, those matter because there's imminent danger and violence happening, but also I think, artists can really help us be more closely attuned to that slower violence, to the ongoingness of censorship and the violence of risk management, really. That comes out in that relationship of at risk that we were talking about earlier.
So what would that look like? And this might bring us back to your book, actually, rather than the essay. But either way, who would be an artist who brings us back to that idea of how risk plays out not just in these like big disaster moments, but on a lower, slower level?
Yeah, I think Samia Halaby is one of those examples because the censorship and cancellation of her retrospective was and is a big headline, is a big crisis-oriented story. It's spectacular, it's horrifying, it's scary, and there are so many other stories to be told alongside it or in relationship to it. And so in the essay, I was trying to go back and also pay attention to a quieter, less spectacular moment in her artistic trajectory, which was when she was denied a renewal of her job contract at Yale, where she was teaching art. And this was in the early 1980s. And so, and she and many people believed that happened because she was outspoken about her feminist positionality, her relationship to Palestinian liberation, and she was thinking about also Black liberation movements at the time. And so she does this really wonderful interview for a feminist zine in 1982 that I quote from in the essay, where she's basically talking about the gatekeeping of Yale, of universities, of academia, and how that's also connected to the gatekeeping in the art world. And it's those kinds of, again, like slower, lower frequency, slow violence moments of censorship, of control, of kind of the exclusionary politics of the art world that keeps its main core ideas of value intact. And yeah, so I was wanting to think about that quieter moment and kind of ask these questions. What would our stories of crisis or at-riskness look like if we were paying attention, again, to what is that makes people vulnerable? And that would be not having employment, not being able to, voice one's beliefs and keep their job. And that's a very important crisis that is very connected to where we get much later when her show is censored too. So, but that's not what's in the big splashy headline stories about a show being canceled.
Right.
So it's more about the durational.
It's
aspect.
durational. It might, those ways that her work and her career have potentially, we can't know for sure what would have happened if in another situation, in an alternate timeline. But if her career has been curtailed in that way, in theory, her show could have been going, her first, retrospective could have been going up at a place that was less at risk. Mm-hmm. In certain ways, like could have been going up in New York somewhere where there wasn't going to be a state legislature that was pushing the university to cancel the show. But
as it turns out, there's different kinds, but just as severe kinds of censorship in New York, and that's part of what this piece is about, which is, and that was a really important part of the conversation and like insight from Rebecca Fassman thinking about the Kinsey, and there's a quote from her in this article because she was reflecting on would Kinsey be safer somewhere else because it's,
and let's just say for listeners,
yes.
Kinsey Institute of Sex Research has been here on the Indiana University campus
since the 40s.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
yeah,
cool. So 80 years, and the legislature has at various points but has, again, recently
And
tried
successfully.
to separate funding of the Kinsey from the university.
Well, saying that state funds can't go towards the Kinsey, which is complicated because we're a state-funded institution, university.
Right.
But yeah, so Rebecca was reflecting on, that kind of at-riskness of Indiana. And I think what we've seen and what we're learning very explicitly from the very violent repression of Gaza liberation encampments at liberal academic institutions in blue states specifically, and red states, but blue states, is revealing that, no, it's not about so much that geography of like a legislative power being more liberal or more conservative that's going to be the protection that one needs. It actually is much more insidious because it comes down to who's in charge, who's in a position of power at each of these institutions. And most often, the people who are in charge are operating within a structure of risk management and policing. So, yes, you will see different moments of elevated violence and repression in different places, but those are all connected in different ways. And the resignation of Warren B. Canders that I mentioned earlier, the CEO of Safariland, who actually did resign because of the activism of artists and staff at the Whitney, actually was a really important turning point because his resignation showed that was possible. And you did kind of see a ripple effect. And at Newfields in Indianapolis, on the heels of that, in 2020, 2021, Warren Canders' resignation, eventually the director of Newfields resigned too, through this kind of durational protesting, which Kelly Morgan's resignation was part of bringing attention to. But I don't think that he would have resigned if Canders hadn't resigned. And those, that happened in New York at the Whitney, and then it happened at Newfields in Indianapolis, very different contexts politically, but there's a connection there because certain strategies were used, social media changes the way that activism becomes legible. So I think the point really is that we are much more connected than we might think. Yeah. And that's why it's even more important to pay attention to people, but in my context as an art historian, artists and curators who are theorizing and documenting and paying attention to the aesthetics of resistance in these moments and historically.
So that, I feel like, does kind of bring us to this bigger question that I would really like answered, which we're seeing a lot of curtailing of people's rights in a lot of different contexts right now. And we're talking on January 9th. And so there's going to be an inauguration soon, new administration, and we can expect to see a lot more of that. So how can art resist fascism, Faye Gleisser?
Yeah. I wish it could. Well, here's something I think about. And this is where I find the history of art really important to understand contemporary political context and contemporary art and its possibilities, because I think it's really important to know that the history of fascism relies heavily on art and the repression and control of visual culture. So on the one hand, I think it's really important to pay attention to those histories, because if we can understand how art has always been a part of power and the maintenance of power, and representation has always been part of that, then there are ways to understand signs of it happening and also counteract those relationships. And I do, there's a very famous exhibition, 2 exhibitions that happened in Nazi Germany in the late 30s. And I believe one was called the Degenerate Art Show, that was basically curated by Nazis who had looted and confiscated contemporary art of that moment, and it was German expressionism, it was abstraction, and the show was intentionally curated in this way that made the viewer feel very claustrophobic, like the works were put very closely together and hung very high up on the wall and in a, confusing kind of way. And the artists in the show were framed as degenerate, as being, really problematic and not aligned with German nationalism and citizenship and the future of the nation. And then at the same time, the Nazi regime also hosted this show of like their vision for nationalist German aesthetic practice, which was basically these idealized neoclassical sculptures that were embodying Aryan nation kind of ideals of embodiment and proportion and anatomy. And those two shows were intentionally shown in proximity to one another. So we do have examples of how art functions within and in support of perpetuating or extending or expanding a kind of authoritarianism, fascist ideal. And that's just one example, but I suspect that if you look at any kind of context in which fascism is mobilized or escalating, you will see the use of images and the repression of diverse ranges of perspective. You'll see a kind of consolidating of perfected idealist forms. And so there's this history of understanding art and fascism. And I guess this question of can art resist fascism is, I guess I want to rephrase the question of if and once we understand these histories of the deep connections of art and fascism, what then can artists do with that history? How can artists be educators of those histories? And what do we all have to gain from understanding that relation of how power manifests? So that's where I do turn to art history, why I do like teaching in art history, because I feel like that is such an important question and it's very timely. And I see artists also rising to the occasion and making art as collective aid, as mutual aid, art as resistance, art as a document of punitive literacy, art as joy and collaboration and in defiance of repression and these really terrifying kind of conditions. So yeah, I guess I think of it less as like, can art resist fascism? But because art is part of fascism, what can we learn from those histories, and what are artists doing that counteracts or intervenes in those power relations that rely so heavily on the production of a kind of fascist aesthetic and the repression and governance of world making?
So you're saying we have to understand the history.
Yeah. I think it's helpful. And maybe not the history, but the whole history, but even just understanding that power, especially in our like image saturated world of social media and, and beyond, and AI algorithms and all of this, that even just understanding how power exists, how it manifests, how it's controlled, how it's deployed. And I do, that's
through art and visual
in
culture.
General, but it's always like a, very short step into visual culture and art and image production.
Right. Yeah.
And also, if you think of the other kind of art production under fascist regimes is like recruitment posters and aesthetics of getting in line and falling in and doing what you're told. And that's aesthetic. That's image production. That is art. I do not buy into this idea of like art is only uplifting. It's violent. It can be very violent.
Or that art is, even if not necessarily uplifting, that it's always some sort of like self-expression that's liberating.
Yeah. Right. Like so this is why I do really value art history as a discipline, because I think one of the most compelling ways to understand world history is through the production of images and objects, because they tell us so much about relationships between people and desire and violence and property management. Like, it has everything there if you really want to understand, right, how power happens not just at a very high level, it happens at such an intimate, small scale, and that there's all these things that connect that smallness to the large level or top-down kind of maintenance of power. And I think that's a lesson that is very usefully conveyed through studying the history of art management, objects, and art history. And that artists who know those histories also are very well equipped to intervene in them, or to educate others in them, and to get people to ask questions.
I didn't expect this conversation to be about Faye's complicated relationship to the discipline of art history.
Oh,
but it was cool.
Me neither.
Like, it actually,
I didn't think
I feel like there was a
that
nice
either.
arc there. It started out with like this like tension, and then also landed on the ways that it's also really useful and important.
It's a tension. The tension is there. It's I wouldn't even say love hate. It's just an ongoing reconsideration of the violence of the discipline versus in relationship to the possibilities of art making that are really inspiring, because artists are dreamers. I mean, that not in a like romanticized way. They are world makers.
Yeah. Right.
And I mean, you can cut this from the interview, but I think every time I teach my intro to contemporary art class, like I tend to get at least one student who will say at some point in the semester, okay, you're telling us a lot about leftist politics and radical artists. Like, where's the conservative contemporary art history? You're repressing it or suppressing it. Like, why are you censoring that? Where is it? And I really love that question, and I always hope it happens like in the classroom instead of in an email or something, so we can talk about it as a group. Because the history of contemporary art is made by people who have big questions about the world and worlds that don't yet exist, and they are breaking convention. That is the history of contemporary art. Is someone did something and it got a lot of approval, and then the next artist is going to come along and be like, I don't think so, or like, I'm going to undermine that, or ask another question, because they're interested in power. They're interested not in having power necessarily, but in the relationships of power that make the world and position each of us differently in that world. And it is harder to find an artist who has conservative investments who is going to be doing world making, because the conservative position and perspective is to go back or to maintain what already exists. So it's a lot more of gatekeeping, border making, territorialized ideas. And that's kind of stagnant. It doesn't change. It's not constantly evolving.
The history of 20th century conservative art is really in the 19th century.
Or like the 1600s. I don't know. And you know, that's not even fair, because there were radical artists in the 1600s,
yes,
you know.
Right.
But I think...
But then their work then became established. And
Right. But in the moment they're making and they're asking these questions and doing something new, that probably wasn't about going back or doing something the same as someone else. That's the trajectory of contemporary art. It's forward thinking, aspirational, radical, alternative, often way ahead of its time. Like the Duchamp urinal you mentioned earlier, that no one really understood what that was. He very belatedly, Duchamp becomes really important in the 60s. I mean, he was an important artist, but he didn't become the Duchamp we talk about now until the 60s, when he remade the ready-mades from decades earlier, because that was a proto-conceptual kind of practice he was doing that the art audience wasn't yet prepared to understand or accept. It didn't have value in the way it did in the 60s.
Right.
So I love thinking about that. I'm if someone has examples of conservative contemporary art trajectory that's like, you know, breaking convention and changing things and one-upping the other, I'd love to see it. Honestly, I mean that. I'd love for someone to show me, but I have, like, that's just not what the history of contemporary art is.
Right.
Largely speaking.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll get some answers on that from listeners to the podcast. Some examples, I mean, answers.
And I'm open to that because I think the point of art is discussion and question. So it's, you know, it's not like a finality. We can have lots of different kinds of art at once. But it is... yes, contemporary artists tend to be the ones who are envisioning things that don't yet exist and are thinking very intimately about the way the world is right now and why and how it could be different.
Yeah. Cool.
And I love that. I'll hang out with artists all day. I mean, that's, you know, the beauty of contemporary art history too. You get to hang out with really smart, interesting people asking questions.
And that's our show. We'd love to hear what it made you think about. Send us an email or a voice memo through the contact tab on our website, wfiu.org/innerstates, or get in touch on Facebook or Instagram. We've got your quick moment of slow radio coming up, but first, the credits. Interstates is produced and edited by me, Alex Chambers. Our associate producer, Dom Hyab, put together this episode. Our social media master is Jillian Blackburn, and we get support from Eobon Binder, Natalie Ingalls, Luann Johnson, Sam Schemenauer, Peyton Whaley, Lisa Robin Young, and Kate Young. Our executive producer is Eric Bolstridge. Our theme music comes from Amy Olsner and Justin Vollmer, and we have additional music from the artists at Universal Production Music. All right, time for some found sound. That was, as you can probably guess if you live in the northern U.S. right now, footsteps in crunchy snow in 4-degree weather. Recorded by Dom Hyab. Thanks, Dom. I'm Alex Chambers. Thanks, as always, for listening.
Riding back at the top of the hunter's moon. See airplanes like stars slinging. Subliminal, we make the rounds and soon. A dead end for hand wringing. I'm coming home. I'm coming home. I'm coming home. I'm coming
Hoosier Spirits is a new documentary from WTIU and Indiana Public Media that explores Indiana's deep distilling roots and visits distilleries across the state to get a glimpse at the future of Hoosier Spirits. Learn more, check out a map of Indiana distilleries, and get the recipe for our exclusive cocktail at WTIU.org/Hoosier Spirits.